Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Find Your Edge. My name is Jordan Nagoli, and I'm your host today. And thank you so much for watching or listening wherever you are in the world. I greatly appreciate you. The purpose of this show is to share behind-the-scenes stories of people's life journey. And the interview that you are about to watch and listen to, I think perfectly encapsulates this mission. Before I tell you about the guest, I have someone to thank for making this interview happen today. She's sitting to the left of the camera right now. Her name is Victoria Gaucher, and she reached out to me a few months ago. Victoria is a part of the United States Taito karate community. Her son is a black belt. Her son Gavin is a black belt. She DM'd me and she said, "Hey Jordan, I listened to your episodes with Mitsunobu, Mitsaki, and Michael. I really enjoyed them. And I have a family member that has a powerful story to tell. Would you be interested in having them on the podcast?" We got on the phone. She shared the story. I was blown away. And I said, yes, please. I would love an opportunity to interview Mike. Victoria connected me to Mike Riveron. And Mike has just a truly powerful story to share today. So first, I'd like to say thank you to Victoria for organizing this interview. You get a producer tag. Mike's story is unbelievable. Mike was born in Cuba, and today you're going to hear the story dating all the way back to his family's history of the Spanish-American War, all the way to the 1950s and 60s when Fidel Castro and the communist regime took over, and specifically Mike's personal experience and the impact that it had on his family and their legacy and how it impacted the future of their family. Before I introduce Mike, I have two things that I'd like to say. Number one, I'm clearly not Cuban. And with that being said, I ask for some patience and grace if I mess up a word, mispronounce something. I don't have all my historical information accurate because, speaking transparently, before Mike and I talked, my knowledge of Cuba and their history was just as much as I learned in middle school and high school. But over the last few months, I've done my very best to educate myself and be prepared. I've got all my notes here, and Mike and I have talked for hours at a time. We've emailed back and forth. Victoria and I have met, and we've really crafted, I think, a solid framework and foundation for the story that you're about to hear today. But if I do mess anything up, I apologize, and please give me some grace. And finally, and this one is more sensitive, is Mike's father passed down the responsibility of sharing his family's legacy. And it's Mike's responsibility to share his family legacy with his children. And unfortunately, Mike lost his daughter, Michelle Berenice, a few years ago. And today we're doing this interview in honor of Michelle. So Michelle, your family misses you. We hope this interview can honor you in your spirit. And we thank everyone for watching and supporting us. So with that being said, Mike Riveron, welcome to Atlanta. Welcome to Find Your Edge. Thank you for being here today.
Hey, Jordan, I'm so happy to be here to share the story, but also to more or less give some past due information about Cuba that we're not receiving right now in any type of forum. And it's very difficult to recall some of the actual aspects because obviously it starts very early in life. I was 8 years old when this whole thing started to unravel, and I hope I can actually give you some information that normally you don't hear. And historical aspects in family is through legacy. And this is the only thing I want to do right now is to pass this legacy to my children, but also to have also an incredible way to express to the generation that we have here that if you don't pay attention, you can lose your legacy and you can lose some of the aspect of your goodness that needs to be there all the time.
Yeah. And Mike, with so much information out there in the world, it's hard to know what's true and what's not. And I think it's so important to document history right now. Before the interview started, you and I were going over your father's memoirs that he wrote decades ago, showing me pictures from the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I'm just so grateful that you're on here today to share this story.
Happy to do so.
And just to set the tone, Mike, give the listeners, tell them where you currently reside right now.
I reside right now in Coral Gables, Florida, which is a suburb of Miami. And I was raised there. You know, I went to high school there and continue my life through different scenarios of businesses that I work for. And I'm happy to actually reside.
Well, I'd love to start. We're going to dive right in. I'd love to start. So to everybody listening real quick, actually, there's going to be a couple different aspects of this interview. There's going to be Mike's family's history. It's going to be Mike's personal experience. And then we're going to, at the end, talk about a lot of Mike's philosophical beliefs, political beliefs to help the future generation. So we're going to bounce around a little bit and try to share as much information as we can. So Mike, let's start with this. Give the listeners a background of your family history.
Well, we're basically from Cuba originally, but descendants from Spaniards, and our family history started way back, even before the Spanish-American War that actually took place in the late 1800s. So my grandfather was a Mambí, and a Mambí is a soldier that actually fought with Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and he actually came to war early in the process, but he was, believe it or not, was taken by his aunt to the front lines at the age of 14. And the aunt said to Maximo Gomez, one of the generals, he says, "I'm giving you my nephew as part of the actual war process." And Maximo Gomez, as being a general and looking at my grandfather that was so young, he says, "No, you cannot be in the front line, but one thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to set you back to my farm, and you're going to be taking horses back and forth from the farm to the front lines." And this is how we started this whole process, how I got interested in family legacy. And we went through many episodes with my father telling stories, and his story is very uncommon because he has gone through some of the hardest possible episodes of his life, and he was actually able to endure.
Yeah. Can you set the tone for just a little bit historical aspect of what the Spanish-American War was and your grandfather's experience with that, with what you shared with me personally?
Well, the war really started much before the end of the 1800s. It started with a 10-year war, and that 10-year war was lost by the Cubans against the Spaniards. And it continued through processes of going through history, but the war never really ended. They continued to actually put pressure on the Spaniards because there was a lot of issues that they were not in agreement with, and one of them was really the power to actually be their own selves, to actually elect their own officials, to get through the process of really being an entity as a human being because they were being oppressed. So after 2 or 3 of these battles, the United States government decided to interfere, but not interference in the sense of going through process of changing the world or changing their nation, but to help what was going on, because what they saw so close to to the United States, only 98 miles away, that things were happening every single day, and there was a lot of atrocities committed. So finally, through that process, that war of Spanish-American War did not last more than a year, right? And from there was an angle that needed to be addressed, which is the Cuban needed autonomy. And that autonomy was really not able to be done by being there and being almost like a father to the kids that they have liberated from this oppression. Mm-hmm. So what they needed was to create a document, which was the Platt Amendment. And that was the beginning of the new country of Cuba. And that was done in 1901. And in 1902, the first election took place. At that time, it was just a learning process. Mm-hmm. But once again, this is not an issue of having to take possession or have to instruct a country or people how to behave and how to actually negotiate with the United States. This was basically help that was much needed.
And what do you remember about the stories that your father told you about your grandfather's experience during that time?
Well, my grandfather was really a Mambi. He was a soldier. After the war, there was really no economic conditions because, just to give you an idea, currency in Cuba remained the Spanish peso until 1911. And so all the economics on a brand new country, it had to actually be built from scratch. So when they actually went back from the war to live in their own homes, they found out that everything was scarce. You know, they were in the process of my grandfather taking horses from the farm to the front line. Not only that they were doing that for the purpose of actually advancing on the column and actually addressing the issues of war, but they were eating the horses because they had no food. So when they got back home, they had no transportation back then. So my father would always say, your grandfather took the initiative that he couldn't stay in the city that he was born in, Camagüey, which happens to be the provincial capital of Camagüey province, that he needed to move. And that movement had to be done on foot. So he had to actually go from the middle of the actual province to the southern part of Cuba, which called a city called Santa Cruz. And that's where he started his life. That life started as a young age. He was in his 20s, and he actually made his life there for a period of time. Created a good business there. They sold the business, came back to the capital city of Camagüey, and then started another business, and then went back to Santa Cruz again. And that's where he started a brand new restaurant with his wife and all of the siblings. My father had 9 brothers and sisters, right? And imagine having all these siblings running around from different ages in different conditions, right? And at that time, it was a very happy life. This was a fishing village, very close on the southern part of Cuba. Pretty much very poor, but very homeland, very homey, extremely able to actually have conversations. People had different values, and everything was terrific until a catastrophe happened in the city, in a tsunami style event that happened in 1932.
How old was your father and when the tsunami happened, the tsunami style event?
They call it a tsunami because the actual surge was more than 40 feet. And wind went up to 175 miles an hour. My grandfather's home was right very close to the bay, maybe a block and a half, maybe 2 blocks away. So when this whole situation happened, started with just water coming in. And my father and my grandfather were at the restaurant at that time. That they started feeling that, something was really, really bad is going to happen. And they said, well, I think it's time to go home. And their home was only a couple of blocks away across the street from a park. When they got there, the water was already knee-high. And they started wondering, what are we going to do? Imagine, thank God not all of the siblings were in the home at that time. Some of them were in Havana, Cuba. But I would say the majority of the family, immediate family, was there. Okay. At that time, they decided to do the best thing they could do is find refuge somewhere, because the water was actually just creeping up and was getting already to shoulder high. And then all of a sudden, they got a knock on the door, and there was 3 soldiers that came in, and they said, we're going to have to evacuate you. So they tied a rope from one of the posts of the home to another house that was 2 stories high. At that time, they started just moving a person at a time, right, to try to basically save their lives and occupy the next property. During that process, the soldiers, believe it or not, that were trying to move our family, they're all drowned. I mean, my father tells the story that one of the sink tiles actually just flew over and decapitated one of them. And so my father, through life, through past experiences, have endured very difficult times, but also survived. Yeah. And that's a story that I want to bring in, that I know that we have episodes of despair, but if we actually really think really hard inside, you're going to find a lot of comfort if you were basically looking back at your family, how they endure things. And that's what my father did, and that's what I try to do, and that's what I was trying to teach my 2 daughters, that this is what you should do. Yeah. When they got to the house, they knocked on the door. They didn't open the door. The soldiers had to actually just tear the actual door apart with a rifle. And then they found out that when they arrived inside that house, a 2-story home, there were more than 60 people there, right? So water was already getting inside, and it was actually really, really terrible experience. You hear the kids screaming. You heard all of the actual aspect of a terrible tragedy. And then they started moving people up in the 2nd floor. Pretty soon, less than an hour, water started seeping up. The boards started popping up, and water started seeping into the 2nd floor. The owner of the property, which I had given so much help to all the families that were there, committed suicide. And then all of a sudden, wind started really hitting hard the house. Water started keeping up, unbelievable height. And then we got to a point that the house started trembling. My father started moving people outside the 2nd floor through a window and to try to actually escape. But ultimately, that home collapsed. In that tragedy, my father lost grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother, father, mother, 3 sisters, 4 brothers, all in one episode. This situation that you feel, sometimes despair takes you to areas that you really are thinking to yourself, this is unthinkable. This is where my father survived. He floated for almost a day as in part of one of the logs from the house, and finally was able to actually, as the shore receded, he was able to basically find out where the rest of the family was. More than 20 members of his family perished that day. And once again, he has come to a situation where there was nothing left in this town, and he needed to move again. So he went back to Camagüey, the capital city of the province. And that's how he met my mom later on.
You shared this with me before the interview, but hearing the account, it's one of the most tragic things I think I've ever heard in my life for someone to go through. How old was your father when the storm hit?
He was just turned 19. He was not the oldest, and he was not the youngest. The younger sisters, when the house collapsed, they drowned immediately. There was only 2 survivors, and then later on there was another survivor that they found out, and then he passed away anyway. But his brother Nicelio survived, and he was floating with my father in different locations, and they finally found themselves, and they both actually walked back to Camagüey, and this was around 80 kilometers away. So once again, you had to start your life again.
Yeah. How did he move forward from there? You said he moved, or he went to the other city. What happens from there?
in there, it took a few jobs, just very small jobs, trying to actually survive. He was very handy. He could actually build things. He was basically a carpenter, even though not by trade. But then he got a job as a postman, as a mailman, right? So he would actually deliver mail to a hotel by the name of Hotel Residencial, which is now called Hotel Puerto Príncipe. And that's where he saw my mom for the first time. A daughter of a very wealthy businessman, but they fell in love and they married. And through time, he actually was able to actually then take over the management of the hotel. And we were living an incredible life. We were well-to-do, but not super rich. We just had a good life, good education. I was part of a private school called Maristas Champagnat, which is basically part of a very prestigious institution of learning. And obviously, we were educated. My mom was a concert pianist, but never really performed. So we had music always in our home, and an incredible legacy in regards to a family that was together, not only by desire, but also making sure that you have to pass that along to your family members. And that's what happened until one day things started changing.
Yeah.
And that's when Fidel Castro started his march.
Yeah. So I want to take a quick pause right there and clarify two things. When were you told about the tragedy in your father's life? How old were you when you were first told about that the first time?
I would say I was 7, 8 years old. We would have really great communication. I was really always close to my father. I was very close to my father and my grandfather. My grandfather was also my godfather. So we would walk every day. Either we would go to the market or we actually roamed through the hotel. And those experiences of telling stories, that's how I picked up the stories.
And I only ask that because what your father went through, I think, could frankly crumble anyone, could stop them from moving forward. So I have such an admiration and respect for your father's resiliency to keep pushing forward, to then go off and start a new life again and keep pushing forward. So before we get into your experience and your family's experience with Fidel Castro, I think it's important to set historical context for people that are not as aware of how it happened, because it didn't just happen overnight. So can you explain to the listeners a little bit of history on the context of Cuba's situation before the government's corruption and Fidel Castro, and ultimately what led us to that point?
I went back, obviously there was a lot of mention on my father's memoir that he wrote when he was 92. And I showed you the copy. Back then, he has a clear picture, even at 92, what truly happened. And this is something that I want to actually make sure that our listeners are listening, which is that you can lose what you have if you don't pay attention. You can lose what you have if you decide to ignore or not to act. And what happened in Cuba and how socialism and communism came in, it was not something it took decades to happen. I feel what's happening right now in the United States, it's not taking decades. And later on, we'll touch bases on that. But here's how socialism, communism came in Cuba. In 1902, first elections in 1906, he was reelected the first president of Cuba, Don Tomás de Entrada Palma, and he decided to resign. At that time, because of the Platt Amendment that was in place, the United States actually appointed a governor and a second governor as well. Throughout the time from 1906 to the 30s, there was a lot of government-type presidential situations, some of them by governor, some actually even by committee, and not as a single president. But one of the things that happened during that period of time is that corruption became a thing of everyday life. And the more you tried to fix something without a permanent solution, really it did not have a great outcome. And it continued throughout the 30s. Some of the actual presidential elections took place in the 40s, where there were elections and they were actually elected. But in the 40s, late 40s, Fulgencio Batista was elected, okay, and he was involved in the change per se at the beginning, but because you really don't know the candidate when this person, which was really part of the military, you don't really never really governed. And this is something that you can see how the deterioration of values change. Cuba had in 1902, around 1902, the first constitution, in 1941, the second constitution, most of them very, very much close to the values of the United States Constitution. But everything else changed. So as we get closer to the early 50s, things started to change. Started, believe it or not, in the University of Havana, in the colleges. The perception of all the students knowing history, getting taught good education, it started questioning the government. And that actually opened avenues when you have corruption, that you're always trying to go through the process of change. But what change are you going to do if what you're going to do is by force taking over a government, right? So the first thing that Fidel Castro did is he started protesting, but then he took armed control of a building, and then he basically went through the process of being captured, and he went to jail. And it wasn't
by who?
By Batista, the president of Cuba at that time. So what happened there was an incredible situation because, you know, sometimes you create heroes that are not heroes. And he was no hero. He was just basically planning his next move.
I want a quick pause right there too, Mike. Can we give a little bit of background on Fidel Castro? Because you even helped me see, if I'm remembering correctly, he was a lawyer as well.
He was a lawyer. He came from pretty good family.
This is a smart man.
He was a smart man, charismatic, right?
An educated man, you could say. Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, I would say his upbringing, you know, was changed somewhere in college. His mannerisms changed. His way of actually communicating changed, and he wanted change at all costs. You just cannot have change at all costs. And that's how it started. So he went to jail, and then all of a sudden, Batista said, I don't want to create a martyr. And he released him. So he was deported, went back to different places in Central and in South America, and then basically then formed his militia.
Yeah.
And then came in, and here's where the whole situation started.
And how was Fulgencio Batista as a president at that time? Would people say that he was doing the country justice? Was it mixed? How were people feeling about his rule?
It all depends who you asked, and obviously you had two sides of the story. The first story, that there was some consistency by fear, creating change by fear sometimes. The economic condition of Cuba in the 50s was fantastic. Cuba had the third highest per capita income in the Americas. All that came with a lot of pressure. There was a lot of aspects of change. One, because at one point they claimed that the USA backed Batista. And the other side came the mafia in regards to the casinos and brought in really undesirables into play. But the whole aspect of what happened, it really created a very unusual atmosphere for the common folk that basically did not believe in the politics. They were business people. They were very fruitful. They were actually really advancing their own agenda by being legal and extremely capable of actually doing business, great entrepreneurs. That was flourishing behind the scenes. But in front, there was the corruption. Everybody getting paid. Everybody was part of this musical chair that you continue to actually make money through government, through all types of gimmies and freebies and everything else that you can think of.
I see. So there's almost two worlds inside Cuba going on at one time. There's the governmental side that people are elected but then are corrupted through a variety of different ways. And then you've got the actual citizens of Cuba that are helping the country thrive, and they're almost battling one another.
Right. And in some cases, with time, you have no choice but to be part of the group, whichever is in power, and that corrupts people as well. So nobody is clear of the demise of Cuba. I think there is an enormous amount of ideas and idealism in the 50s in Cuba that sometimes you don't understand. Some of it is economics. Some of it had to do with malicious intent. A lot of it has to do with the fact that nobody took action to correct it. And, people of wealth were part of the equation as well as people that were poor. And really, in all honesty, even though Cuba was flourishing, you had a literacy higher than any place in the Americas, right? You're not going to believe this, but believe it or not, Cuba had more TVs per capita than any other country back in the 50s.
Wow.
More radio stations, more TV stations. The first color TV, air conditioning came in and played to buildings. All that was part of the equation of growth. That's how Cuba was, which really was regarded at one time the pearl of the Americas.
So this is a thriving nation during that time. So let's go back to Fidel Castro. He's arrested by Fulgencio Batista, but then he's released because he doesn't want to create a martyr, which I can see makes sense. So what happens from there? And can you share how Fidel Castro came back in, and then there was the coup that started, and why? Why was he doing this?
Well, and it happens in any democracy. I truly believe that democracy should be dynamic. It should be something that you work every day to improve. When you stall and you allow other forces to take place and make decisions for you, and you don't really stand up, that's when things start unravel. Fidel Castro, with a group of a couple of hundred militia, they came in to Cuba, and they resided back into the Oriente province, Sierra Maestra, which happened to be where he started his guerrilla warfare. And that actually started in the late 50s, right? He actually was almost defeated by the Batista military regime, but continued. And a couple of other people came into play, you know, besides just a Cuban. Che Guevara came to play, Camilo Cienfuegos came to play, and there were really comandantes that were part of the actual militia.
Mm-hmm. So during that time, give a little context to Che Guevara on who that was and where he came from.
Well, I can tell you, first he was Argentinian.
Yeah.
People say that his intentions from the beginning was socialistic in nature and also communist in nature as well. This whole process didn't take place in a long period of time. It was a short period of time. So he was more of a guerrilla warfare person, hands-on, extremely cruel, had no intentions of giving any type of, I would say, kindness to anybody, because that's how he was and how he portrayed himself, right? And I can remember as a child, as the war was actually winding down and Fidel Castro decided to start marching towards Havana, which is the opposite side of the island. They had to pass by our province of Camagüey. And at that time, he basically said to Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, you're going to have to stay here and take over the province. And that's how I got involved with a personal touch, so to speak,
yeah, absolutely.
from Che Guevara.
Before we get into that personal touch, just to set the tone, so Batista is elected in the 40s. Fidel Castro, they start to fight and battle. At what point does it cross over to where it's like, okay, now Fidel Castro is looking like he's going to win and take over? How long was that period?
I have to regress because obviously Batista became a president twice.
Okay.
So the first time he was elected, the second time it was a military coup.
Got it. Okay.
Right. And this was really the foundation of corruption. Took over. At this time, the United States was not involved in making any corrections at that time. Some people say that the United States was part of the actual, they backed them into play, which I don't see the correlation, but it's one of the things that they say. Mm-hmm. But the fact that you take over a country by military force, that did not stand well with people.
No.
And even when the economy was doing the best that it can be, at one point, you're not really a free country if you're taken over by somebody that has their own ideals and his own interests, right?
So the corruption started with Batista.
But the corruption has been on and off in different presidential situations. I mean,
but in terms of overthrowing a government, that he did that as well. Okay, so that time it wasn't even his by election. He
by election.
Okay,
exactly.
Okay. So from there, so he overtook it with a military coup for the second time. The first time he was elected. How long was he the president that he overtook at that time?
Well, it was sometime in the early 50s, and obviously after the revolution started, that was started by Fidel Castro, it ended in 1959.
Okay, so thank you. We've set the tone for a high-level overview of her historical aspect. And for anybody listening, I do encourage people, there's some amazing videos online. There's a lot of good education to really dive more into the details of what went on during that time, because it's so much more than what we could talk about in detail here. Let's pivot over to your childhood, because there's two timelines going on at the same time. There's this in the military, and then there's your life experience. So going back to your childhood a little bit, for the first few years of your childhood, you said it was great. You had a great relationship with your father and grandfather. They had thriving businesses. Share a little bit more about that time, and then lead us into your experience with Fidel and Che.
Okay. So our daily lives was, it was precious to us. We lived outside the city of Camagüey in a neighborhood called Puerto Príncipe. My father built his home there, a beautiful home, and we would go to school right almost 3 blocks away from our family's hotel, and it was actually very close. The main drag in that city was Avenida de los Mártires, and right 3 blocks away was our school. And everything in life, we were a member of the tennis club. We had an incredible life as kids, extremely education driven by my mom, that was, pretty much the person with the pressure to actually succeed, even though my father was really a person to admire, right? But my mom was, she told us what to do. And that's something that happens almost in every family, right?
Yep.
So I remember occasions that I would walk with my father in the morning at 4 o'clock in the morning on weekends and to the market, because he would take me there. We would have breakfast. He would actually choose some of the materials to actually start the cooking. He owned a restaurant on the bottom floor of their hotel called La Cazuela, and all of the actual getting ready for that weekend's meal and everything else, he would actually take me to the farmer's market and pick whatever he needed for that day with his chef that would actually accompany him sometimes. The same thing happened with my grandfather. My grandfather was an incredible person, self-made. There are stories how he actually made his money and everything. It was all his wit, his idea of when to act and when not to act. These are things that are born with and picked up by legacy through your family members. And that's something that I want to make sure that everybody understands, that you have to listen to your parents. You have to listen to historical aspect, because that's where you learn. Your foundation is always driven from there, right? And there is always a token of perfection that you're never going to reach, but it's there if you choose to take it, right? We all thrive to be perfect, which is almost impossible. But I think that if you sit down, listen to your family, get involved in the legacy side of your family. How did we get to where we are? That's something that is necessary for everybody, and especially right now when we're in such difficult times where families are not really together sometimes, or when families are not really appreciated the historical side because either we're so busy being something that we're not, right? And that's something that we need to actually bring back into the family. You need to get a foundation, and you need to start seeing things simply, not complicated. Simply, it's there for the taking, and that's what you have to do. My grandfather I would actually go through the hotel, and he would take me floor to floor, and he would actually say, "You see that grandfather clock over there? That's going to be yours someday." And he would tell me all these funny stories that that any grandfather would do. I was lucky enough, my grandfather was also my godfather. So I was very close to both my father and my grandfather. And from a distance, no question about it, I really admired my mom. And because she was incredibly intelligent, super educated, incredible gifted in regards to, she was a pianist. So I loved basically hearing the stories and the music that she loved. She loved jazz and things that basically you need to start getting your education as a human being by really getting the culture that you need. And that's something so important to do. We're spending way too much time. Our generation has to start getting some discipline and in instructing our kids that we need to sit down, relax, forget about those phones and social media, and start looking at the historical side of your family, but the whole historical side of your country, you know, and appreciate what you have done, what they have done for you, you know, how we got here, and is so important. Yeah. So it's, for us in Cuba, I don't remember anything that was negative, and I'm sure there was a lot of negative things that was happening. I think that, no question, like in any other country, not everybody's equal, and definitely not in the 50s or the 60s. But that's something that you have to say is better today than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And you're going to find things that you could have changed. And this is something that you need to start thinking. You have to start looking at what the future entails.
Yeah. If we look through history, every great nation falls at some point. It has happened consistently throughout history. And I really like what you said at the beginning of the interview, which is if you do not pay attention to what you have, you will and can lose it. And it's been documented across many cultures and many continents. One of the reasons why this interview, I wanted to make it happen was, and I share with you a little bit, you know, my grandparents and both my parents are being immigrants, and my grandparents coming from Albania and experiencing the communist regime and what they went through had a major impact on my life growing up. I was consistently told about what my family had to go through, and it reminded me the blessings and the opportunity and the privilege that we have here in the United States. But as you said, just because something is great right now does not always mean it's going to be great. And darkness can be in the shadows. And once it comes out of the shadows and it's in the light, it can be difficult to destroy if something's already being overtaken. So with that being said, can you lead us into what happened now, the crossroads with Fidel Castro and Che in your personal experience?
Well, as I mentioned before, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos and other comandantes, they call it comandantes, were in the Sierra Maestra, which was the eastern part of Cuba. But very mountainous. They had some success in some battles they lost. But at the end, the Batista government was unraveling. And think about it in this fashion. I don't believe that Fidel Castro had more than 500-600 militia people with him. How can you actually overrun a military, I would say, impactful with upgraded arms, more than 30,000? How can you defeat it unless there's dissension already happening and corruption taking place, and even the military is actually against your own presidential situation, right? So things started unraveling at the beginning of 1958, and even though battles were won and lost, I think at one point there was already some feelings that this whole thing was going to unravel. So at the end of 1958, Fidel Castro started marching from the eastern side of the island to Havana, which was on the other side. And then he left Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara in Camagüey. As I remember as a child, both by conversations with my father and my personal experience, Che Guevara came to see my dad, and he asked my dad very forcefully to basically occupy the rooftop of the hotel and put two machine guns upstairs in the roof, facing the garrison that was a few blocks away. At that time, a battle took place, a couple of days, just shots over back and forth. We had moved from the outside of Puerto Principe already into the city because we were in fear that the revolution was taking place, and my father did not want us to be outside the city. So we were really in the battlegrounds, close to the battlegrounds where this was taking place. So after 2 or 3 days of battling back and forth, they took over the garrison. And one of the things that we used to do as a child, every single Sunday we would have like a brunch, a lunch, in my father's restaurant. And that day was not an exception. So I still remember the entrance to the hotel, you had a lobby, and then you had like a little dispensary on one side, and then you continue walking, and then you open the door into the restaurant. And then as I went in with my father, you know, I glanced to the left side, and there was this big table, and sure enough, Che Guevara was there with Camilo Cienfuegos. And my brothers were running all over the restaurant. I mean, they were a lot younger. I was very young. You know, I was 8 years old, and my twin brothers were 7, right? So Che Guevara said to my dad, "I want to meet your kids." And my mom heard him saying that and had a small conversation with my dad. And my mom was, like I said, she was exceptional. Said to Che Guevara, "I'm sorry, but the kids are not going to, they're afraid of you. You have machine guns. You're sitting with other militia people in the corner." And I don't think, I can see my brothers starting to cry when they said it. But I was already there close to Che Guevara with my dad. So my dad had no choice. And Che Guevara took me by my shoulders, put me in his lap. Every time I tell this story, I can smell that rancid smell that he had, his body odor, his cigar smell, because it was so impactful for me as a kid to have somebody that was not really a noble person that you see every day, which as a kid you say, you know, you're afraid of things that not normal, right? But the thing that stood the most in regards to this story is what he said to me. And this is an impactful statement of what happened later. He said to me, "You see everything you see here, this restaurant, this hotel, you don't own this. It's owned by the revolution." I was 8 years old. My father, I can see his expression. And I couldn't believe that day, and I don't believe today, how he was cruel to say the things that he said. But we knew at that time, I knew it as a child, and my father knew it throughout the time that he spent there after, that this was going to be the end, and soon. And that's my impactful meeting with Che Guevara.
It gives me chills just hearing about it. You guys were in such a dangerous situation at that time. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if someone said or did the wrong thing, you guys could be killed in that moment.
Yes. His idea of actually governing, which basically he never governed, it was all by fear, right? And things happened after that because obviously...
Did your father give access to the roof? Was he forced to?
Oh, no, he was, listen, that part I'm not 100% clear, but I know that he would have never given access unless he was put in a position to
Yeah.
to have no choice but to do it,
Yeah.
right? My father he didn't fear anything.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to make clear, my father was not a politician. My father was a business person. My father was a father and a friend to many. But certainly he was not part of the political arena of the Batista regime or any other regime. Okay? Even though from both sides of my family we had presidents of Cuba, he was never part of it because they were all through our grandmothers from my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family.
Yeah.
So, but he was really never involved in politics. For him to be involved here into this type of situation, it was something that was not really something that he was looking forward to do or to actually experience. And this is going back to experiences. Experiences can be very negative, but you can learn even from negative experiences. And it's kind of interesting what happened after, because obviously Cuba, was a very successful nation. And even though with all the corruption, needless to say, we don't hear much about what's going on with Cuba. But the fact is that, January 1st, 1959, Batista left the country, right? And Fidel Castro, days later, took over. Mm-hmm. And from the beginning, everybody thought the Messiah is here, but little did they know that his intentions were completely different.
Yeah. And what blows me away about that story you shared is at 8 years old, you understood the danger that you were in at that time. That, to me, if a child can understand what they're going through at that time, that says a lot about the people they're experiencing with.
Well, it depends how you look at things. If you're basically involved in learning what I need to learn for the future, I was always interested in what I could hear from my grandfather and my father and my mom, right? And I loved baseball. I played baseball. I did what other kids would actually do with no problems. And I never said I had a perfect life, but one thing I did have is that I always thought from early on in my life that I had a future, right? Little did I know, and that it was actually going to be shortened by acts that were completely out of my control. And as a child, 8 years old, when you're receiving proper education and openness in regards to what you need to learn, and being fair in regards to what you're taught, and being truthful, you actually pay attention. It's something right now that I don't see happening in our education of the kids. I think they're channeled to learn something that they want to pass through. And indoctrination is what this country is going through right now. In little pieces, people are being, their goodness is being erased. Their future is being altered. And these are things that are happening every single day without anybody standing up and saying, listen, this got to stop.
Yeah. Which is the same thing that happened in Cuba as well during
exactly.
this time. So let's go to that part. So you have this experience, 1959, you said January 1959, mm-hmm. Fidel Castro, Batista left, Fidel Castro takes over. What ramifications did you see in the country and experience during that time?
Well, I saw many incidents, but here is how historical events happened. At the beginning, because Fidel Castro was in that revolutionary mode while he was trying to take over, right? I still remember my father saying, and then I was able to verify it later in some of the actual manuscripts that I've read, is that he was for pro-arming the population because he wanted them to fight with him, right? Well, the first thing they did is did exactly what I see some of the politicians now trying to push the, let's forget about the Second Amendment. And the first thing he did was to confiscate all firearms, right? In an event of a nation being lost and you have no way to fight, even though in the Spanish-American War, more than 50% of the soldiers fighting against Spaniards did not have firearms. They had machetes. The only way that you can actually stand up to this type of a regime is by having firearms and owning and starting what you need to do to make it happen, to change. This is things that happen really early in the process. The next thing was called the agrarian reform, which meant reforma agraria, which meant that here comes, let's distribute the wealth of whoever had the wealth, and it didn't matter who, unless you were politically connected, and share it with the poor. Well, this is a concept that brings what I feel is a complete indoctrination by freebies, pretty much, which, by the way, is something that is very impactful if you go back to history in the history of Cuba, which what happens is that they said, we're going to distribute the wealth to the poor. That never took place.
Before Castro or during this time with Castro, or both?
Both.
Both, okay.
Right. And you say to yourself, so where did the wealth go? Well, definitely to Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and the Communist Party, and anything that has to do with wealth actually was never distributed. These are the people who have the wealth. These are the people that they confiscated foreign investments, the likelihood of every single concept and type of business that was in place in Cuba that came from the United States and other parts of the world. And they did it for their own gain, not to distribute, but once again, corruption within the communist and socialist regime, right? That is something that I fear that could happen.
Yeah. So they take the weapons, they take people's money. What do they do to the education system?
Well, my education started early, and it was through the parochial type of education through the Catholic Church.
What does parochial mean?
Well, what it means is it's a concept of unity and the combination of education and religion.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And how you basically use religion as the foundation, and then
got it.
And then the goodness associated with that religion, regardless of the religion, is what actually is the foundation to go forward.
So that was your education as a child.
Right.
And what happened not only to yourself but to others once Castro had taken over?
Well, the first thing he did as one of the, first year, or maybe even less than the first year, he completely decimated the parochial school and the private school system. Right. He wanted to indoctrinate. He didn't want somebody else teaching the kids. And then he created, and this was the foundation of how I left Cuba, what they call patria potestad, which means that as a government agency, you could take possession of your kids and give them education that you want them to listen and to receive. this was the concept of getting rid of all the private learning institutions. And all of them were actually, teachers were from all parts of the world. This is how you become worldly, you know, and removing that educational system was an enormous change in the society of Cuba.
And it sounds like, I mean, they've taken away three of the most important things to have people run their society: the education, the money, and the weapons. So they're systematically removing tenets that people rely on to all focus around one thing: control.
Exactly, controlling and corruption. And at the same time, you have to understand that by getting rid of the parochial school system and the private system, you're also restricting religion. Because there's no question, you know, the demise of the Catholic Church in Cuba, even though it still remains there, was actually, you know, you could find churches almost in any neighborhood, you know, and that was actually curtailed as well. You know, persecution in regards to the religion or whatever religion was in place, you know, communism doesn't have a religion in place. It's the destruction of one, you know, and the worst thing that you're going to feel and find that is the primary reason is to have control, right? And in the absence of goodness, what do you have? You're going to be shifting your values step by step, which is what I see now in the United States, not in the same type of situation as Cuba, but, you know, it's kind of interesting because I'm in the middle of actually writing a book called Shadow Consequences. And that actually are things that are happening in the background that you don't see every day, but they're happening. And if you start erasing history, if you start erasing past history, good or bad, when you don't have a legacy, when you start the destruction of religion, when you basically say that you cannot be this person, you have to be that person, when you're against each other for whatever reason and no reason, that's where countries and democracies die.
And I also think that part of what makes our country great right now is the ability to have freedom of speech. And just because you say something that somebody disagrees with doesn't mean you should be able to put that person in prison. Or the cancel culture that we have nowadays is that, and again, it's okay to say something that other people disagree with. That inspires healthy debate and healthy discussion. And it sounds like, can you speak on that a little bit in the 50s and 60s of how Fidel Castro, if you would speak out against him, what would happen?
Well, there was absolutely no mercy. I mean, you were basically placed in concentration camps or into sugar camps to basically cut sugarcane. There was at one point during the Cuban history where if you were in school, you needed to actually do labor at one point. Any type of labor, you know, if you want it or not want it, right? Your parents that were left there that couldn't leave were put in a predicament that basically they had no control over education and their kids. And this is how a society changes. It changes by actions that are basically just so focused to change that they ignore, I would say, education, even though there was still education taking place, but more into the angle of indoctrination than in education. You know, I have said, and I mentioned this to you, that one of the things that I regret the most about not being in Cuba is not able to contribute.
Yeah.
You know, and that is part of a lot of the Cubans that are still alive in this side of the pond, so to speak, where basically we feel what the Cuban people are suffering, but we also feel that during that exodus of Cubans leaving the country because they couldn't really tolerate that regime, that the brain power was drained from Cuba, and it actually passed to the United States, and it actually benefited the United States like any other legal immigration takes place in any country. There's some benefit to it.
Yeah. And Mike, I want people to understand your heart and where you're coming from, and tell me if this is accurate. You want to be sharing all of this because you went through it yourself, your family went through it, and you had to leave and lost a country that you love so very deeply that made you into who you are, and you don't want the same thing to happen to the United States.
That's right. My father, and going back and regressing back to in the early years of Fidel Castro, right after the Bay of Pigs invasion, my father was arrested, okay, and put in a concentration camp. And ironically, that concentration camp was just across the street from our home in Puerto Principe, where we had our home outside the city. So I still remember the episodes of my mom saying to me, go and see your father on the other side of the fence, and seeing my father in the middle of this monastery that was confiscated and turned into a concentration camp, and see my father right on outside because there was not enough room. They had a couple of thousand prisoners in there. And I see my father there. So he was there for, I believe it was 2 to 3 weeks, including with my aunt. Yeah. A person that, the most docile, the most kind person, non-politically connected.
Why were they put in there?
In my opinion, in the case of my father, the chef of the actual restaurant wanted the restaurant for himself after Fidel Castro took over, and he accused my father. And this is basically a story told to me by my dad, and there are other implications that happen in there, because obviously what happens is that, imagine losing everything in a very short period of time, getting arrested, right? And then at that time, after he got out of that concentration camp with my aunt after that, that's when the family decided that we need to send the kids across. Mm-hmm. And then prepare ourselves to actually join them later. And that's what happened.
So, I mean, this is insane. So the impact that had on the community, not only, so there's kind of two sides to this. There's people that are against it, but then there's people that are for it that are trying to profit and benefit off of the new regime that is happening. So you're causing significant destruction across the community that was once thriving.
Absolutely. And by the way, it's not the same thing, and you have to compare it in very different time frames, because obviously we're looking at different time frames. But one of the things that Fidel Castro did early in the process, he created almost like a neighborhood watch, that if they saw somebody doing something that it was not with the regime, then they would actually then tattletale that action, and then they would get compensated.
So they're incentivizing people to further the regime.
Exactly.
Damn, this is so dangerous.
It is a dangerous situation. And you don't see it in the same aspect as you see it now here in the United States. But when you start giving out things for free, mm-hmm. or getting compensated for actions, mm-hmm. These are things that are going to alter the makeup of democracy. And because you're now paying for something that should be natural to you, to act accordingly to the rule of law. But that's not the case anymore. In Cuba, it was a total degrading of democracy, a total degrading of religion, a total degrading of wealth, a total degrading of personal beliefs. you did not have an opinion at all. And if you did, and it was against the regime, you were completely taken out. And it's not an act of survival. It's an act of, you had two choices. You either became part of the regime or against it, or you had to leave because you were against it. And those are the solutions that you had back in the 60s, in the early 60s.
And your family made the decision to leave. So walk us through that. What do you remember being told at that time? So 60s, you're born in 50s, so you're 10, 11 years old during this time?
I was 11 years old, and right after my father was let go out of the concentration camp, there was according to my father, they had a family reunion. Our family was four. It was five of us, so 3 kids, right? So I had 7 other cousins. And this generation, ages from 8 to 14, right? We decided, and we're talking about our parents, decided that if we were left in Cuba, we were going to be indoctrinated. And our values were going to be deteriorated to a point of no values at all, right? So it was kind of interesting that a movement from Miami, Monsignor Walsh, in the 60s, really started in 1960, and whoever was left in the parochial side or the actual archdiocese side of Cuba, they made a connection to send kids across before, and it was very, very planned, very much planned to an age bracket, because it was allowed to take the kids out with some permission of the government as long as the kids were not old enough for military service, okay? And so that's how the movement called Peter Pan flights was born. United States gave permission for Monsignor Walsh to basically assign waivers and visas to the kids, right? So legal immigration came in, and the flights started happening. A lot of the kids came into camps. I was one of those kids. Our generation, our 10 cousins, we all left. 7 in the first flight, 3 in the next flight. So our grandfather was already in Miami, and the deal was the following. You either went to a family member or you went to foster homes or orphanages, okay? And one of the things that happened during that period of time, and I still remember my father saying, I want you to, and this was critical in my observation as being, I need to know a little bit more about my homeland. My father was wise enough to tell me, listen, I want to show you the island from one side to the other. So we took a trip by train, by car, in whatever method that we wanted, just to learn our island before we left. And that was the period of time that we found out that we were going to, our whole generation was going to move to Miami. Wow. And at that time, I still remember my mom, there were times I would see my mom crying and my father crying, and believe it or not, my father would cry more than my mom. And this was impactful, but I still have episodes of blockage because it was a terrible ordeal. It actually impacted my brothers more than it impacted me, but it still impacted me.
Yeah.
That I was going to lose my parents for a period of time, and who knows how long it would have taken them to come back to us. And that was actually an issue. So my brothers and I, and we were 7, came in the first flight, and we landed in Matacumbe, Camp Matacumbe, which is very close to the Keys. And we were there. It was almost like a naval base in there. So the Archdiocese of Miami did not say, for big family members that were joining any type of family in the United States, you couldn't get the kids all in one shot.
Yeah.
So first there were my girl cousins first, and then my younger cousin, and then my 2 brothers, right? And then the oldest was a 14-year-old, and I was 11-year-old, and we were the last one to leave. But it was within days. We basically then moved to our grandfather's home.
Before you left, how long did you have between when the decision was made, we're going to get on these flights, to leaving?
Indirectly, I would say a matter of, months, but maybe a couple of months. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because there's some parallel to dates. I'm a believer in 6 degrees of separation. I'm a believer that things, history repeats itself sometimes.
Yeah.
If you're not aware of what's happening, something is going to happen. If you don't take action, then who else is going to do it for you? Mm-hmm. I arrived with my cousins 9/11, 1961. So 9/11 to me means both sides.
Yeah.
Right? And so as terrible as it was, we arrived at our grandparents, my grandfather, not my grandparents, my grandfather by himself, 80 in his late 80s. So imagine not a female, not able to cook technically, having 7 grandkids in there. Who was going to do the wash? Who was going to actually do the laundry? A total nightmare in there.
How long had he been in Miami at that point?
About a year. Okay. Right after, in 1959, when he lost it all, he had already started moving some pieces. He bought 3 homes in Miami.
He's a good businessman.
Yeah,
he knows what to do.
We were doing business in Miami anyway.
Okay.
Right, and he had certain connections, but most of his wealth he lost, just like my father's wealth was lost as well. But he was able to actually at least have something in here, and we moved to where he was living with my grandfather. And then things just got out of control, because how are you going to have a very older person just try to raise kids, right? Put them in school, making sure homework is done, feeding them. It got to a point that the neighbors started worrying about us, and they called child services, and child services came in, and they actually asked questions, and they said to my grandfather, you just can't take care of the kids. So we were all 7 of us moved to a foster home. So we were there for about a week, because it was almost like a distribution center to see how they would split us up. So I went to Carol City, which is a suburb of Miami. My brother George went to Hollywood, which is a suburb of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My brother Kiki, Achilles, went to Coral Gables, Florida, and that's the connection that I have now in Coral Gables, where I'm from. And during the period of time that we were in foster homes, we never communicated with ourselves.
This is the early 60s. There's no way to communicate.
Yeah. And obviously my parents came to the United States just about a year after, right? And once again,
That's a long time.
yes, once again, the key was that the Archdiocese said, no, you cannot take the kids out all in one shot. So my mom and my dad visited us and said, okay, who do we need to take out first? Because they're not in a good situation. And so I was first, believe it or not. And then it was my brother George, and then lastly it was my brother Kiki, and he was in a very good home, and he had a great deal there, and he almost didn't want to leave. He saw the benefit of having foster sisters too. So,
Oh my God.
that was actually something incredible for him. But ultimately, we got together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any communication between you and your parents for the year that y'all were apart?
Never. None.
So they could have died. Any of you could have died.
We didn't know.
No, you would never have known. And when you left at that time, there was no guarantee you'd ever see each other again.
No. And I'm going to tell you a story that happened the day that we were in the airport waiting for the flight to leave.
Yeah.
And the airport in Havana is called Rancho Boyeros, and they call it the La Pecera. And the Pecera is like a fish pond, all glass, right? So I could see my mom crying because they were not with us, where we were in the holding side, and my father crying and seeing my father leave because he couldn't take it anymore. And I still remember that impactful day when we left. I have times through the years, I have recalled situations that I was not able to recall. I had blockage of time frames during that time, all associated with what I feel was, such a culture change, such a, mind you that even though we had good education, I did not speak the language, right? And I can tell you, and I'm so grateful for the United States to take us.
Yeah.
I still remember when I went to be evaluated by the school, right?
In the United
Miami,
States.
in Miami, they gave me a test. My math skills were 2 years ahead of time. So the principal of that school, in combination with the English teacher, Mr. Cunningham, I still remember Mr. Cunningham came to me and said, you don't need math right now. What you need is English.
Yeah.
So I'm going to teach you 2 periods of English, one literature and one English. So the education was tailor-made, at least in that school, and the school name was Shenandoah Elementary, right? Then I went to Shenandoah Junior High. Then I went to Coral Gables High School, right? So the education, although I had a small little stint in a parochial school in Carroll City called Our Lady of Perpetual Help, the education that I received back in the 60s was stellar, in my opinion, right? I'm not 100% sure we have that now.
Yeah.
I think that there is a division of what they're teaching and what they want the kids to know. By omission, they're teaching. By obstruction, they're teaching. Indirectly, they're indoctrinating. And directly, they're not teaching the whole scope of what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
So those things are things that change every single day.
Yeah. And what you're taught as a child can drastically influence your view on the world and what you do with your life. And it's really important that we take seriously what we teach our children. Do you remember the day that you saw your parents for the first time again in Miami?
Wow. It's my mom left that day after, she saw, my mom made the decision who to take first to live with my grandfather again, right? And I still remember that day, my father was driving a 1951 Chevrolet that my grandfather owned, and the day after, then I was actually picked up and looking at, and I still remember that day, and I said, 1951, we had a brand new car every single year, and the last time I drove a car was a 1957 Chevrolet, and I still remember that aspect of that day. Did it make sense to me back then? Oh, sure, it made sense. I was a kid. I was still a kid, and I had gone through a lot, but there's still the impact of changing also made some impactful decisions that I made throughout, my life.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, Mike, so before we move on to the new life that you had to build in Miami, how many children were on the planes in total for the Peter Pan flights?
14,000 plus, according to the latest number, and very, that brain power that was exited from Cuba actually did pretty well in the United States. You have, Emilio Estefan, husband of Gloria Estefan, he was a Peter Pan kid as well. Armando Codina, also a Peter Pan kid. Mascanosa, a Peter Pan kid. So you, past chairman of Coca-Cola was a Peter Pan kid. So you have a lot of shifting of brain power from one country to another. And unfortunately, if you really think about what's happening right now and what you hear from Cuba, you don't hear any news from Cuba. You don't hear the news from the people. You hear about the starvation. You hear about the inequality of wealth. It's incredible to think. And this, if I tell you, and I did some research in regards to what I feel is the demise of that population, of that homeland, 85% plus is below poverty line of the population, present day. Now imagine having that scope of fear and just complete chaos if we had it here. Yeah. But 87% of the population is below poverty line. You don't hear from people because everything's controlled. So one of the things that they did, with so many radio stations, with so many TV stations, they got rid of all of them. Newspapers disappeared. Only the state channel for television and radio, and one newspaper, the Grammar newspaper, and that's it. So the voices are unheard. And if you even want to revolt, and there's a lot of dissidents right now in jails, you can't, because you have no voice. And when you have a voice, there's a chance that things would change. That period of time of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, and now there's supposedly an elected president, which, in my opinion, if you only have one party, you don't have an elected president. That's all you see over there. But the silence, that there is no voice, you don't hear unless you talk to family members. You hear that they've been very resilient because they've had to survive.
Yeah.
But survival, in what mode do you really exist when you're always in survival mode, right? And that's basically what's happening right now. The infrastructure is not existent. The buildings are dilapidated. The tourist centers are the only ones surviving. Employment is what the government gives you. Medical, they claim they had great medical and great doctors and research. Yeah, that might be the case for that particular situation, but it's not really something. Entrepreneurship, it existed after 45 years for a period of time, then it was removed again, then it's supposed to come back now, and now you say that there's some social media, but now social media is also controlled, and heaven help you if you make some type of comment that is against the regime in social media. So technically you have no freedom of speech whatsoever. You have, their version of the Second Amendment doesn't exist. The right to survive as a human being doesn't exist. What's the future? What you were actually told the historical side of Cuba was, which, by the way, they do have, even as negative as it was during the period of corruption, before the period of corruption, it's like saying, oh my God, let's compare that to what happened back in, before the Constitution was signed in the United States. At least you had people that were trying to change. And that was the beginning of the story of Cuba, that after the Spanish-American War, things was supposed to change, and it did for a very short period of time, but really it didn't last. Once again, comparing what happened there and here is possible, but the common denominator is the corruption.
Yeah.
Corruption opens up for another avenue. And when democracy is not open, the next thing is socialism, communism, or Marxism, or whatever you want to call it, but it's definitely not a benefit to society or to the nation. So that's how it starts.
I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I think a good time is now. As someone that has experienced it, both you, your parents, your grandparents, and had to leave a country that you love so dearly, what do you think is a way that people present day can see corruption for what it is? Because I think sometimes it's hidden. It's not always apparent right in front of your face, and then also take action against it.
Well, I think, and this is a message to the younger generation, and I would say people that actually live right now in the United States, which is a very complex society. You have to say to yourself, nothing is free. There are consequences. The same thing, if you get something for free and what you're doing is buying votes, then you technically don't have a democracy. You're creating a false environment for your kids. Young generation, I really, truly believe that the first thing you have to do is question everything. Don't take everything for granted. Don't be a follower. Be a leader. Get yourself in a position to understand history. Do not allow history to be erased. There are good things and bad things in history. You learn from both sides. You don't want to be on the wrong side, but technically you have to choose a side. And at one point you have to say to yourself, am I going to do something about it, or I'm just going to actually sit down and wait for something to be ignored? You need to basically understand that there's got to be a way to understand what's happening, but don't be a bystander.
Yeah.
You're going to ignore things so rapidly if you think that you're being geared to an area that feel comfortable because somebody told you that it's comfortable.
Yeah.
But is it comfortable? Is it something that is just? There are a lot of things happening right now, trying to abolish the Second Amendment, which is actually not something compared to Cuba, where they actually took all of the arms. You know, the whole nation, more than 11 million people, are basically under the control of a socialist communist party.
Yeah.
Right? You have no way to basically revolt and make a change because your oppressors are the ones holding the firearms and the ones that actually do harm to you and your family, right? So you start looking at what's happening right now as a situation. Political parties basically just at each other's throats, you know, and you don't know what happens, and you say to yourself, am I in the middle watching this story happen in front of my eyes, and I'm just standing still and I'm not doing anything about it? To the younger generation, I appeal that you need to follow history, learn the historical aspects. There's so many good things that happened, you know, back into the 1700s and before and going forward. Trials and tribulations of a democracy, it is a dynamic situation. The dynamic situation is nothing that stands still. Yeah. It's always evolving. It's going to have bad times and good times. But when you see things happening that are basically for free, where basically you're giving things and you depend on the government to provide, you're technically not part of the process. You're basically a bystander.
Yeah.
You're basically going through the process of, okay, as long as it's free and I don't have to pay it, you know, it's okay. I mean, let's look at what we see. The national debt is over $34 trillion. You know, who's gonna pay that?
Yeah.
You know, I'm in my 70s. I may not see who's going to pay it, but I certainly hope so that somebody says, hey, does this have to continue or there's a better way to do it? And I think there are so many ways to resolve this issue. But one of the things that I see that is missing, you know, goodness is missing. I think everybody's after each other's throat. I think everybody is complaining. I think we're wasting so much time in not looking at the big picture, which is our family, our values, our God, our information that should be flowing freely, that we shouldn't take everybody's word for as the gospel when it's not. And it's not something that you see in every single country, and every single democracy that has failed is because of no action whatsoever. And I think that we should actually step up and do what we need to do.
I think that's phenomenal advice, especially for the next generation. So, Mike, before we dive even deeper into the political aspects and what you want to continue to share, talk to me about life in Florida once you moved there, your parents came over, and your family was reunited. Just walk me through how you guys rebuilt your lives.
You know, from entrepreneurs and businessmen, and my father was, my mom really the head of the family as to us kids, because my mom had really the control of how we behave or not, and heaven help us if we were on the wrong side of the road. When we got here, my father, his first job, for example, he was pumping gas. He went from a successful business person, managing wealth, to pumping gas. Why? We had no money. We lost it all when we came here, right? So he has to start over. My mom, which it was our education, our culture, our music, her teachings, the that continued, but she really never worked. So she became a seamstress, right, in a factory. So that's how we started. So at the beginning, we were poor because even though they both had jobs, you know, thank God that our grandfather we were living with our grandfather and we at least had some place to live. But that changed. My father, going back to the good thing that my brother had in Coral Gables, his foster father was the head of the physical plant in the University of Miami. And so he offered my father a job, you know, and he worked for the University of Miami in the buildings, just doing anything that he needed to do in regards to the student housing and the condition of the dormitories and all that. And so he worked for the University of Miami until he retired, right? My mom was a seamstress for a period of time. You know, as a kid, I had a newspaper route, just helping out and doing what I needed to do. I was very good in sports, so I played baseball and football in high school. You know, had a lot of success playing both. Never really played professionally, but that foundation also gave me some experience of teamwork and concepts and all that. My father passed away. Once again, you go through the process of your parents taking care of you, and then you have to take care of your parents.
Yeah.
Right.
How old were you when your father passed away?
I was in my late 50s.
Yeah.
Okay, when that happened. My mom passed away before, so he lived with one of my brothers at one point, and then lived with my other brother another time, and then he lived by himself in many occasions. Then my mother passed away, and then at one point or another, I had to make a decision, so I put him in a very nice adult living facility, and then it was very close to the house, so I could actually visit him. We would watch baseball games, and really enjoyed my father almost to the last moment that he passed away.
Yeah. Your parents are two of the most resilient warriors that I've ever heard of. Yeah.
I mean, and that actually taught me other things that I needed to know because, you know, adversity can happen more than one time, you know, and you think that, you know, lightning doesn't strike the same day or the same night or even on the same moment, right? But it gave me a foundation, including my wife, which is another exceptional person, also from Cuba. I married a Cuban person that actually came to the United States at the age of 8, younger than me, but not through the Peter Pan flights, but like 6 or 7 years after the starting of the revolution. And we took care of my mother-in-law, my father-in-law at one point, my 2 brothers that already passed away, and my father and my mother through the process. I've been married for 46 years. So during that time frame, you have to give back. And giving back doesn't mean money. It means emotions. It means nature. It means the things that you need to do as a human being to remain a human being.
Yeah. As you grew up and as you built your life in the United States, did you and your family reflect on what happened in Cuba? Obviously, it always stayed with you. Did you try to move forward and not discuss it, or was this something you would always be looking at what was happening?
No, it was a topic of almost every single dinner that we had together, my father would say, next year we'll be in Cuba and this thing is going to go away. And for decades, he continued to say that. But don't worry, Mike, you'll see it one day. I haven't seen it, right?
So they had hope.
Yes.
But it never came to fruition.
And this is something that you have to understand, which is something that most people don't understand. And we don't talk too much about this. Losing your homeland in the way we lost our homeland, you have to say to yourself, how did it happen? That's number one. The changes that took place and how it changed our world, right? But at the same time, when you look back and you say, is there a hope that things would change in Cuba? And the more time that passes, the more difficult it becomes. Because the people that knew better are 6 feet underground. And when you're indoctrinated, and this is the fear of being indoctrinated, is that you don't know what is good or what is bad anymore. You just know what you know that you were told to know and to accept. And I just don't hear, because most of the people in my generations were in the 70s or 80s when we came, and my father's generation is gone. And therefore, what you only hear is, and this is what you hear from today's society, that they're idolizing Che Guevara. And you guys don't know Che Guevara. What you know is what you hear from people that did not go through what I went through. And Che Guevara, there are accounts that when they went ahead and abolished arms, he was involved in these assassin squads to go after people that had arms, and officially, through certain information that I was able to capture, he was personally responsible for killing thousands of people. So don't tell me that he was a revolutionary. He was really an incredible criminal with criminal intent to cause harm. Another aspect of this population that needs to be aware. We're trying to be told that criminals have more rights than people that actually are affected by crime. And we don't see what it does to society. What we're doing is ignoring the goodness that we're supposed to have as a society and completely discard goodness from the picture and think that everybody has the right to commit criminal acts. And that's not something that is going to benefit our community as a community first and as a nation next. So when you start doing things to protect people that don't have, I would say, the right to receive that protection, then society dismantles itself. And that's something that we need to fear. That's something that there's an attempt to change. You know, what you have to earn is earned. It's not given. What you have to basically go through life in the process of all types of decisions. These are timelines that teaches you how to be a human being and a member of society. But if you're not through the process of learning and interpreting goodness from negativism, from criminal acts, then you become what you become. Yeah. And you need to change. This is what I say to the younger people. You need to observe. You need to go historically. Inform yourself. Don't pretend that you know it all. Go ahead and start searching. There are so many examples of false media and false information outside, and it needs to change.
Well, I'm so grateful that we have someone with your capability to share these stories and this real life experience, because I do think that people take information from the past and they glorify cruel criminals without an understanding of what went on. Because let's be frank, nowadays so many things are just headlines, they're just text, they're just videos, they're comments. This is a real life experience. You went through this. You lost loved ones. Your family lost loved ones. You had your country taken from you that you never got to go back from. So I'm really grateful that we have you documenting this story here, because people need to understand this history. I think this is a perfect time to segue. I know we wanted to introduce, you had a passage from your book that
Yes.
you wanted to read as well.
So I've been working on this book for a few years, and I started back in 2008. And it happened because I thought that things were happening behind the scenes that sometimes they were so overt that, you couldn't really find a rhyme or reason why it was happening. So I decided to call my book Shadow Consequences. And when I started writing, I had my first chapter. It was called The Politicians, right? And I want to read this passage, and it's the following. The difference between an elected official and a politician is past and future. These are promises made and promises ignored. The promises made during the campaign were shaped through idealisms carried over the years of past events. The elected official has a short shelf life because they all become politicians by ignoring why they were elected and how. This is true to all politicians because the actions or lack of actions are not controlled by the one, but by the collective. Their party's idealism, their agenda, or by notions that the other side is wrong and actions are needed to counter the other side is a big issue. It's clear by the past events that when they go to Washington, they join an elitist group of fraternity brothers and sisters eager to show that they belong. Their course of action, as well as intended as they may seem, are not driven by the people that they elected them, but by other factors. The fact is that, unfortunately, in a democracy, it's open season for anything that you can do or not do. If you're allowed and you have no consequences, things happen and they continue. Think about it in this matter. In the last few legislative agendas, actions by politicians, why is one party completely voting for something and the other party completely is not voting for that situation? There's got to be somebody who has a difference of opinion. Mm-hmm. Unless you follow the herd and you follow that party's ideas and agendas. You're ignoring who elected you. You're ignoring the fact that there's got to be a difference of opinion, and that difference of opinion has to be diverse. And there's no way that with so many Congress people and senators that everybody has the same idea. And it has to be because we're driven or they've been indoctrinated to be what they are and what they're trying to accomplish because of the party ideas and concept. I think that we're losing our perspective as a nation because we're following the herd. And this is one of the things that I said about the younger generation. They need to really not follow the herd. They need to be leaders because somebody's going to have to say, this got to stop. This cannot survive. The democracies are lost for less than what is happening right now. The fact that we're basically waiving complete, educational loans, it's an act of buying votes. It's nothing else. Because by judicial aspect, you cannot waive this type of debt at all. And there are other actions that they're taking place. I still remember back in 1998 when they passed the Affordable Housing Act, that changed the concept of the American dream. And the American dream was to own a home. But they actually diluted the underwriting practices to have everybody own a home, including the people that couldn't afford it. And that actually caused another situation, database of 2008 and so forth.
Yeah.
There is a wrong and a good. And when you start basically trying to say that good is bad and bad is good, then we lose the perspective. And then all of a sudden, internally, we're indoctrinating ourselves. Internally, we're following the herd. Internally, we don't care because we're standing by and not acting, and we're not taking the real course that we need to take, which is to, hey, somebody had to stand up. Yeah. But somebody also has to be standing up next to the person who wants to stand up. And because one person cannot do it. So we need to get to a point where we have a choice because we believe it's a choice, not because somebody else believes it's your choice. And that has to happen quickly. We're losing perspective, we're losing our democracy, and we're losing it in a very quick way. Social media has put that in place. The mainstream media has turned this whole thing as to a fight that nobody's going to win. And what is true is not happening, and what is false is taking over. And where do we go from here? Our legacy has to be, somebody has to be a watchdog to our legacy, especially to our founding fathers of this nation that basically they died to put the Constitution in place and have a constitutional agenda that actually serves as the guide that we have right now. And it's incredible that we can still use the Constitution to really set us straight in a course that we can actually then behave as human beings.
Yeah. I agree that it's so important to have people stand up and take action and to have your brothers and sisters next to you standing up. Part of what it takes to stand up is courage and resiliency. And a concern that I have is, especially with social media and instant gratification that we have nowadays, is a lack of resiliency, the inability to endure. And you and I have spoken about this many times. You had to endure with your family and your parents had to endure as well. How do you think our present day generation can be taught a level of resiliency and endurance that is needed to fight back on the issues that you and I both see?
I think that what we need is, I still remember, I've been COOs of companies, and we would actually do something, and that was actually commendable because I had a good mentor that was the owner of the company. And one of the things that we would do is have a think tank, right? And that think tank would open up possibilities, but we would identify ourselves as to what we did wrong and what we could do right? And at one point, you have to say, wow, is there a way that we can resolve this issue without being at each other's throats? And as an individual, you need to actually have a focus into the future. If you stay in the present and you ignore the past, if you don't look at the future, you're never going to actually resolve the issues that you need to resolve. So the first is to identify the problem as the younger generation, and then it's not to destroy the past, but to fix it. And you cannot fix it if you are going to have an enemy as your next door neighbor because he doesn't believe the same feelings and rights that you have as a person. And that is happening right now, both in our political parties that are basically destroying the makeup of our country. And it's not something that is done lightly. It's happening, and in so many ways behind the scenes. But right now, the social media and the mass media, they don't care anymore about, we have to do it from the back door inside. They're doing it in plain sight. And you have to identify what's wrong and what's right. So how do you do that? The first thing you have to do is say to yourself, I am just going to be informed. I need to get informed. I need to go back. I need to spend time. I had, while I was actually running this lending institution, I had something that I instituted with my staff, and it was called the 85-15 rule, okay? You work 85% of the time, but you plan the other 15% for the future. I think you have to sit down and say, wow, what can I do to change this? And it happens not only in a global sense, but also individually as a person. And then don't be a stranger to your partner and say you're not part of it. God, it's already there, so make that person next to you. And that person has a neighbor, and that person has a friend. And basically, maybe there's a movement that can happen as we look at the future. Because economically, our debt, national debt, is out of control. The situation with interest rates on credit cards, it's out of control. How are you going to actually purchase anything that is major appliances and all that and pay 27% when it used to be 13%? I mean, start thinking about things that have gone wrong recently, and you would have to basically fix it somehow. And don't allow political parties to control your emotions and your future. You know, that is happening every day, and it cannot continue. So the next time you hear somebody saying, hey, you know, I think this person is doing the right thing, and then you say to yourself, God, but I'm paying twice as much today as I used to pay yesterday, and you say, oh, it's okay. Why? Because you think that whatever you owe is going to be forgiven, and all of a sudden you don't have any fear in spending when you don't have the money, so you're not actually controlling your economic condition. You need to plan ahead. You need to actually see what is coming, because it's coming if you don't fix it.
I think it's already here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're experiencing it. And there's multiple sides to it, because the big factor is social media. People, we live inside of echo chambers, and I have my business built off of social media, and I think it could be an amazing tool. The ability to contact someone and access someone, FaceTimes and phones are an amazing, amazing tool, but there can also be the dark side of it. And people have these echo chambers that they build where it's, I believe in this, and so I'm only going to follow this, and I'm not going to look anywhere else. And a thing that concerns me, which I know you and I have talked about, is if I say my favorite food is chicken and you say your favorite food is beef, we can agree to disagree. But we're at a point in society now where people will say, you're not even allowed to like beef, Mike. I'm not going to be your friend anymore. I'm not going to like this anymore. But then they have on political levels as well. They have that. I mean, with what we're going through in society, with how people feel. Oh, I feel this today, so it's reality. And I think stories like yours are so important to remember. Hey, if you're so focused on these minute details of how you feel in society, someone else is going to be controlling things behind the scenes, and you will have your freedoms taken from you.
And that actually is dynamic in place because obviously there's conditions are not static in nature. They're basically evolving. And one day you're going to see that there's a spark of hope, and that spark of hope needs to be nurtured and need to be actually placed in the forefront so that you can actually then make a better life for yourself. And also, if you're having a better life, your neighbors are having a better life, your family is having a better life. So social media has worked good and bad. I think I've seen a shift recently, just recently, where there's more opinion as to what are we doing than opinions, what are we hating, right? And I think that needs to continue. I mean, Jordan, you know, we're having this conversation, but you know, you're part of the solution. So if you're part of the solution, your friends can be, I can be, I know I can be, and family members can be. My God, we're already in a community to try to better the situation. So let's just start growing this into a movement that will have some type of positive results to our kids and our grandkids. Because I live right now to actually give my granddaughter a life, and in the absence of losing my daughter, I have my other daughter, Mercy, and I also have my granddaughter, Mia, and my son-in-law, Mike, which is incredible. And he's raising Mia like a mother and a father. So these are things that when you're in front of an adverse situation, you have to do what you need to do, right? You just can't punt anymore, you know. And unfortunately, we're in a football sense, we're in a punting society right now.
Deflect.
And reflect. And we have to reflect, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that there's people like yourself in the world. I'm trying to have a platform here to give opportunity to people to share their stories so that this can be documented, so that your grandchildren can hear it and it can be shared with other people. And I think you're right. There's a lot more conversation right now of like, hey, something needs to change. We cannot keep going with this right now. What would you say? I have a few questions before we wrap up. One that I didn't write on here, but you know, you spoke so much about your parents, and they just seem like such incredible people. If they were here in the interview room right now, what would you want to say to them, Mike?
I can say the following, and I can get emotional about it because, you know, what they did to send us across to the United States, it took a lot of guts. Yeah. It took foresight because they knew that in the absence of goodness is indoctrination to evil. And there has to be a way to give them the credit in this part of this podcast, to give them credit to what they did, you know. I've been lucky, you know, my wife is an image of goodness, and also a person that is so diverse, and this person is just completely incredible. And And Michelle took everything that she taught her when she was alive. Mia is doing the same thing because my wife is, in the absence of our daughter, is like a mother as well. And we all have to say to ourselves, it only came from teachings from our elders, from our parents, from our grandparents. And my mom, my dad are heroes to me. And I can only say that I'm here because of them. Yeah. And they have all the credit in the world for me.
It's beautiful, Mike. And if you don't want to answer, that's okay. I don't want to make things more difficult. What would you say to your daughter, Michelle, as well?
She was an exceptional daughter. She was ahead of her time, and her time was cut short. But one thing that she had was the idea that she wanted to live. And it's commendable under adverse conditions. She suffered through seizures after she gave birth to Mia. But she was always had a smile. And that comes from her DNA. She was the light when she would go in a room.
And the last question I want to ask you, Mike, before we wrap up is, what message and legacy do you want to leave for your grandchildren and for the next generation that is listening to this interview after everything that we've talked about?
I think that, and we have said that we need to be educated both in the street and in public education or private education. And I believe in education. But think about what are you learning on the streets that is just as important to you to know, because you're going to need to, the practical sense of education needs to be incorporated to the times that you're living. And that means that you need to go and focus. And just remember this, and this is the last thing I want to say, is that I know of so many people that don't have a college education, and they are overachievers. And they take it because they have the drive to go forward, and nothing will stop them. And we need to change this concept that we are what we are taught. How about what we need to do, and what our future lies is only there for us to make it better.
I agree, Mike. Words cannot express how grateful I am for you to fly up here from Miami to come to Atlanta and share your story. You are so strong. Your memory and recollection is incredible. What you went through as a child, as a young boy, and as a man, you've faced so much adversity and grief, and I look to you for inspiration. I look to you for resiliency, and thank you for coming on here to share the courage of your family's history. You have honored them. Everyone looking down on you is proud of what you shared today. And as the generations come and can go back and listen to these interviews, I think it will accomplish the exact goal that you had, which was making the world a better place and establishing that your family's history will not be forgotten. So I think you have honored your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, your daughter. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on this platform and giving me the opportunity to help share your story.
I am so grateful that you invited me, and I thank God that you actually gave me that opportunity, because there's no question that it's important to share stories but it's also important to take that story and move it forward.
I agree, Mike, and that's everything that we've done today. Whew. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a heavy interview. I am so grateful to Mike and his family and to Victoria. I have a challenge for all of you, is learn, research your family's history, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. I wish I could have had my grandma on this show. It is our responsibility to push the world forward. It is our responsibility to document history, and it is our responsibility to stand up against people that want to take from us. I believe in everyone that listens to this show. We can make the world a better place. It's from people like Mike. It's from people like Victoria that are not fearful of sharing the good, the bad, the ugly. You have my commitment to continue to share stories like this. So if there's anyone out there that is listening that has a story to share, please reach out to me. We will put in the time, work, and energy to accurately tell the story. Thank you all so much for listening and watching and supporting. I love you all, and I will see you on the next episode of Find Your Edge. Take care.